Welcome back to another episode of the Real Health Podcast. So today we are finishing our series on caffeine. We're going to talk about the health benefits of caffeine in terms of performance enhancing abilities, not just with caffeine from coffee, but from tea, and even one of my favorite ways to drink it is yerba mate. We'll also finish up some Q&As, and again, this is recorded, so if you're new to the series, or actually you've been following us for a couple years now, most don't realize that this is actually recorded on YouTube. So if you want to, make sure you follow the link on our Instagram to watch the episode, because today, right now, actually, I'm going to show you a way that I drink some of my caffeine, and that's through a what we call yerba mate. So yerba mate is, I guess it's in like the tea world. So it's in that tea space, but it's not technically a tea. It's not from the Camellia sinensis plant. It is separate. It's more like an herb. It's a South American herb from like Uruguay or Portugal even. And it is pretty incredible. Now, I wouldn't say it tastes the best. So the traditional way of consuming yerba mate is, if you look here, it's from a gourd is what we call it. So this gourd also has a metal straw that sticks out called a bombilla. And so then if you look here, you pack all of the yerba mate in it, and then you get hot water and you just pour it along the side of that yerba mate. Now, with yerba mate, the reason why I consume it over sometimes like coffee or even tea is mainly because the antioxidant benefits to it. So you just pour hot water in it, and it just sits in there, and then you just slowly sip on it through the straw, which I'll do through the rest of today's episode. So yerba mate, let's talk about it, because one of the questions somebody asked was specifically, let's see, who was it? Sharon asked, what's the difference between coffee and tea, and is one better than the other? So let's talk through that by exploring yerba mate. We're gonna talk about tea, and then we're gonna talk about coffee. And so when we look at caffeine from those three sources and all of the incredible health benefits of those types of plants, herbs, or even the coffee bean itself, what we learn is that most of these substances that we're consuming have high levels of anti-inflammatory effects. There's something we call polyphenols. Now, in the world of polyphenols, those are just antioxidant-rich phenols found in plants. So yerba mate is something that is high in caffeine. So you get about the same equivalent to maybe 4 to 6 ounces of coffee. But you don't just get caffeine. You're also getting a ton of dense minerals. These minerals are essential, and that's probably why it tastes very earthy and almost like grass dirt type flavor. So it doesn't taste the best, I'll be honest with you. It is an acquired taste for sure. But yerba mate also has actually the highest like antioxidants in it compared to even green tea, which is even better than coffee. So when thinking about the health benefits of coffee and tea and yerba mate, what we find is that if we look at the cardiovascular system and we realize that, hey, this is reducing cardiovascular risk, reducing inflammation within the cardiovascular system, reducing even blood pressure, hypertension, which all studies point to with coffee. The question is it caffeine that's doing that? And the answer is probably not. Caffeine alone is probably not decreasing high blood pressure, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease risks. What we find is actually the antioxidants within coffee, the antioxidants within green tea, and the antioxidants within yerba mate are benefiting the cardiovascular system. So if we extrapolate caffeine out just by itself, it's not going to have those potent anti-inflammatory effects. It's still going to have athletic performance enhancement. It's still going to have mood enhancement, cognitive enhancement. but you're really, at the end of the day, you're not getting the anti-inflammatory effects from the antioxidants found in these plants. So when assessing whether coffee or tea or yerba mate is the best form to drink, you just have to ask your question. Hey, what are my goals in consuming this beverage? So for me, if I'm trying to get a lot of bang for my buck, yes, I'm getting caffeine from yerba mate and green tea. But I'm also getting a ton of other health benefits to it. And we just look at the antioxidants and the mineral content and the richness of the beverage. And for me, tea and yerba mate outweigh coffee. Now, don't get me wrong, I still drink coffee. I love the flavor and the taste of coffee. And specifically, an anaerobic fermented coffee is like an incredible experience for me. But when we look at the actual like health benefits attached to it, yerba mate and green tea, in my opinion, they're favored by over coffee itself. Now, when we look at a question that was asked, this was from Dr. Al Cobb. So Dr. Al asked what the benefit of green tea is, specifically because it has something called L-theanine in it. L-theanine, this is a great question. L-theanine is something that a lot of people are actually starting to stack with their caffeine. So they'll take 100, 200 milligrams of L-theanine when they consume caffeine. And actually, you're seeing it in health beverages as well. But L-theanine is abounding in green tea. So the reason why green tea has this like energy and focus and alertness, yet for me, it doesn't like overstimulate me, and I feel pretty like chill and relaxed, but yet focused, is really that L-theanine. L-theanine is a type of amino acid that works on the glutamate system of the body, and so it has a inhibitory effect and allows our nervous system to kind of calm down, so it doesn't get overly excited. And this is the benefit of L-theanine, which is rich in green tea compared to another type of tea, which is black tea, which is roasted a little bit higher. L-theanine is really high in green tea. And that high theanine content with caffeine is really where you get the beautiful effects of like stimulation and calming. And for me, it just prevents me from like feeling the lull and the crash associated with just if I were to consume caffeine alone, which to me is more indicative of my nervous system being revved up and like dopamine output being high, and then kind of feeling the crash of it. So that's why I prefer typically to consume green tea and yerba mate as my source of caffeine versus coffee. Now, coffee, you can get amazing health benefits from it. The problem is because coffee is so highly produced and it's so highly consumed, it's really dirty. Coffee in and of itself is becoming a dirty health beverage. And when assessed, what we see is coffee is full of pesticides, herbicides, and mold or mycotoxins. And so my disclaimer with this is whether you're drinking yerba mate, green tea, or coffee, the first thing and most importantly is make sure it's organic. Organic is vital to prevent your body or exposing your body to unnecessary pesticides, herbicides, and mycotoxins. When those coffee beans are just sitting in those big containers, they're growing mold, and that mold isn't removed through roasting, and it's absorbed within those beans that then you release when you drink a cup. So it is a high mycotoxic beverage. And so you can actually look for mold-free or mycotoxic-free and organic coffee, and I would highly encourage that as your primary source of coffee. Green tea, obviously we want it to be organic, and my favorite type of green tea is called Gyokuro. And the reason why, if you've heard previous podcasts of mine, I'm so passionate about Gyokuro is because one, it tastes amazing, but two, I mean, you notice a cognitive enhancement when you consume gyokuro. And I think a lot of it is because they pull the first leaf, the top leaf off of the bush, and then they shade grow it. And what this does is allows the most amount of theanine to come to that leaf. Actually, when you look at tea as a whole, the most amount of theanine is at the top leaf of the bush. So when those are picked first, that's what we call gyokuro. And so gyokuro is a Japanese green tea that has incredible health benefits, but also, again, I definitely notice cognitive enhancement when I consume it. And I feel very similar to when I consume yerba mate. And mate can be consumed like in a traditional gourd style, like I have here, or it can be consumed in a brewed format. I actually put it in my espresso machine and pull shots of yerba mate. And so there's so many different ways to consume it. And from a caffeine standpoint, it's one of my favorite ways. So when looking at caffeine, coming from coffee and tea and yerba mate, the health benefits, especially when it comes to the cardiovascular system, because we know those three, they impact not just the cardiovascular system, but they have anti-cancer, anti-tumor, anti-neurodegenerative properties. So, but we look at it and we say, hey, is it due to caffeine? And really, it's not. It's directly attributed to the antioxidant, the polyphenols, and the additional properties found within the plants themselves versus caffeine itself. Another question is, at what age is it appropriate to start drinking caffeine? It's a great question. And so, Brett, let's address this because when we look at the addictive properties of caffeine, it's mainly due to the dopamine releasing system, the reward with it. And it's important to note that whenever I don't know if you realize this, but people really have a hard time giving up their coffee. And the reason why is because when you consume caffeine, it's so rewarding to the brain, but it attaches itself to the experience that you're doing. And so what we find is that when you consume caffeine, let's just say when you're reading your Bible in the morning, this can actually create a habit of reading your Bible in the morning. Not because, let's just take the spiritual out of it for a second, not because the Bible is benefiting you spiritually, but actually the caffeine that's rewarding the brain with dopamine and its association with reading the Bible makes you want to read the Bible, so the brain gets what? It gets the caffeine. So what we find is that caffeine has a very potent reward cascade effect to the nervous system. And this should be, this can be enhanced, like this can be supported or be a supportive tool to your healthy lifestyle where we consume caffeine before maybe some things that we don't want to do or we're not motivated to do. For instance, let's just say there's a season where we just don't want to go to the gym. What we find is that if you consume caffeine 30 minutes before you train, your desire to train the days and subsequent days ahead and weeks ahead and months ahead become a lot stronger because of the dopamine associated, the reward associated with caffeine and whatever it's connected to. And so for this happens to be the gym or reading your Bible in the morning or whatever the activity is. And so because it has such a strong neurological effect, going back to your question, Brett, is we just have to be very careful to know that caffeine is addictive. It also has a strong brain reward dopamine effect that can create a reward to whatever that child is associating it with. So let's take maybe a negative. Child drinks caffeine like a Coke and plays video games. Their tendency to repeat that same event in their life is increased. Their desire to play more video games is associated with the caffeine that they're consuming and the dopamine release. And so maybe we should use caffeine when consuming healthy foods right before. Sprinkle a little caffeine on kids' broccoli or asparagus or whatever they don't want to consume. So they start consuming more of it. But joking aside, when we look at kids, I would be very careful with how we are introducing caffeine to the child, because it will create addictive properties to whatever they're doing, and just addictive properties of caffeine. So it's surprising, but guys, kids are consuming caffeine already. It's in Cokes and sodas and chocolate. So it's already being consumed. At what age should we be intentionally consuming it is a different question. I think if we have a healthy relationship with food and beverages, and we understand the risks and benefit associated with caffeine, then we can use it as a performance enhancer. There are studies that show caffeine increases reaction time, coordination, memory, mood, alertness, focus, physical dexterity, endurance, power output. So when you give a kid, maybe a teenager, a little bit of caffeine pre-training or pre-game, they'll directly see a benefit with it. So are we willing to walk with them in that journey of when to use it, when not to use it? Or are they just going to go on their own and start consuming a ton of it and become addicted to it and then have it associated with negative behaviors? So just be mindful of that. I'm not going to give you an answer of an exact age. I more or less just want to create some clarity of what caffeine is doing so that you can apply it appropriately, because it is a psychoactive drug. That's what it is. It just happens to be culturally acceptable and consumed a lot versus non-cultural accepted drugs like THC or CBD or whatever else is consumed kind of behind the scenes. So just be mindful of that, Brett. But great question. So going back to some of the original conversation around caffeine as a psychoactive drug and the benefits of it neurochemically, I did want to touch base on that we do have to think of caffeine as a performance enhancer. So one question that was asked is it how much caffeine should athletes take for optimal performance? This was asked by some people at Armor Gym. How much caffeine should athletes take for optimal performance? And when should we consume caffeine? So again, this is something I mentioned before, but taking caffeine about 30 minutes pre-workout is a good timetable to be associated with enhancement of some of those things we just talked about in terms of power output, physical dexterity, endurance, mood improvement, everything else. So about 30 minutes before. And going to our previous episode, 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram in a single dose is kind of the recommended reference range. So again, if you're 100 kilograms or 220 pounds, you could take 100 to 300 milligrams pre-workout and be within that tolerable range. That doesn't mean you need to. It just means that that's what research shows as being safe without having really any negative effects. If you want to learn more about caffeine and how it can affect your body, your brain, make sure you go back to the original episode that we talked about last week so that you have understanding about caffeine and what it's doing to the brain. But in general, 1 to 3 milligrams, 30 minutes before you work out is where you're going to see benefit. There are some studies that were actually done, and this was specific to students that are learning. So let's just say you're studying for an exam, for a test. And what they found was actually if you consumed caffeine after you're learning, so whatever you were trying to study, and you spent an hour and you studied that material, they showed whether it was before or even after you actually enhance memory formation to that information, even when you consume it after the fact. So for me, if I'm trying to be motivated to train, then I'm going to consume my caffeine pre-workout. But when it comes to memory formation and cognitive enhancement, we find that if you consume caffeine after the learned behavior or whatever you're trying to recall, then you get a beneficial memory response. So that's something to keep in mind for students, depending upon if you want to sit down and feel all jittery, or maybe consume the caffeine after the fact of that learned behavior, and you'll still get the same benefit. So when we look at caffeine, we realize that, hey, this is the number one most consumed psychoactive drug. It's addictive in nature. It has a strong associated behavioral connection with whatever we're using it with or for. And so we should be consuming it wisely. It also impacts our sleep. So going back to our first episode, making sure that you're consuming it before 6 to 8 hours before you go to bed. It does have a hormonal effect on the body, and that's mainly through the system called cortisol. So if you find yourself crashing halfway through the day, then make sure you delay the consumption of your caffeine 60 to 90 minutes after awakening. This is kind of a summary of some of what we touched base with on the first and second episode. And as always, if you're interested in learning more, feel free to direct message us, call us with questions, and we'll make sure that we answer that even on future episodes when we're not even talking about caffeine. So that's a good summary of caffeine as a whole, when to consume it, how to consume it, and what beverages you may want to consume it in. Again, thanks for listening to the Real Health Podcast.